Excuse me.
Yes.
There's one thing I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
Or mention, you started out talking about how little this had to do with the actual novel, which I
Yes.
did read as a kid
Yes.
a long time ago.
Uh-huh.
I remember when this movie came out, I was reading, I believe, an interview with Mann, and they asked him that very question.
Yes.
He said, no, we had no intention of coming close to the novel.
Absolutely.
They were more interested in coming as close as they could to the original screenplay from, I believe, the movie from 1936 or
Yes, the one
37.
that starred
Right.
And that's exactly what because again, with filmmaking, and even with writing, particularly with filmmaking, simply updating theoretically, revising, using an already existent story as the basis is often much easier than coming up with
With an original thought, yes.
And that's, of course, exactly what he did. There have been many films made, not necessarily of the last of the Mohicans, but of the Leatherstocking Tales as a whole, a kind of montage. Some of them are called The Last of the Mohicans. Some of them have different titles, but they're all based loosely, I mean loosely, on the Leatherstocking Tales. So what you discover, even in The Last of the Mohicans, at least Michael Mann's version, is that what he did was to extract from some of the other novels scenes. For example, there's a very famous canoe race in the Pathfinder, which in the order of Hawkeye's life, Nathaniel Bumppo, not Nathaniel Poe, is the novel that follows The Last of the Mohicans in terms of Hawkeye's development as a young man, as he moves from Deerslayer in the Deerslayer to Hawkeye in The Last of the Mohicans, to Pathfinder in the Pathfinder, to Trapper in some of the later novels. But the canoe race in The Last of the Mohicans you just saw is from the Pathfinder. There is no canoe race in The Last of the Mohicans. Similarly, in The Last of the Mohicans there are two captivity narratives. The girls are twice captured. In Michael Mann's version, there's only one. And what's most interesting is that in addition to Cora and Uncas interacting with each other as opposed to Hawkeye, Mogwai also is very drawn to Cora. And in fact, he dies because of it. In the end of the novel, as Cora is being pulled up the mountain, one of Mogwai's braves kills Cora. And Mogwai, absolutely driven mad by this, in turn kills his brave. And then he is not killed by Chingachgook, but instead he tries to escape and he leaps across a crevasse, catches onto a rock on the other side, and Hawkeye, with his trusty rifle Killdeer, Hawkeye, the long carabine, the long rifle, he shoots him. Now the reason this is a part of myth and history is because Thomas Cole, the great Hudson River Valley painter, painted four different illustrations, four different scenes from The Last of the Mohicans. And for those of you who are very much interested in American art, I would recommend that you go over to Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, which last summer not only had a special exhibit of the New York Historical Society's collection of Thomas Cole paintings, but they also had some additional Thomas Cole paintings, including one of the illustrations that they borrowed from another librarian. I was talking about that, talking about Cooper and Cole and the connections between the two there. So what you will discover is that Cooper, first of all, one event, the destruction of Fort Boyd Manor, which became part of The Last of the Mohicans, in turn became part of a series of paintings by Thomas Cole, and of course has since become a film, comic book, and a variety of other animated shorts. So one incident can take on many lives. The difficulty is that in attempting to compare those interpretations, we have to somehow discover the truth. And that's why a text, a document, is a particularly effective vehicle. To give you one simple example, in Cooper's novel, The Deerslayer, which is the first of the Leatherstocking tales in terms of Mattie Butler's life, or Hawkeye's life, the last one written. Judith Hutter, a woman of the world, shall we say, who's stuck on the Glimmerglass lake, ends up proposing marriage to Hawkeye. Hawkeye, by the way, never marries. Hawkeye says no. And he says no because he has, of course, learned that Judith Hutter is not the purest of women. But when Judith Hutter asks Deerslayer for his answer, will you marry me? She proposes to him. And because truth is the Deerslayer's polar star, he says no. And the question becomes, why did you say no? Here I am for the taking. And as it turns out, she read his answer, as Cooper writes it, in his countenance. Because she discovers that it is in what the novels from 1841, when the novel was published, all the way through 1987, printed that in a consciousness of undeserving, UNDESERVING, a consciousness of undeserving, Judith walked into the forest. Now, what scholars discovered was that was a mistake. If you want to talk about the importance of documents, one single word can completely change the interpretation of a novel. Can you imagine how many times the Vietnam War has just since it happened been interpreted and reinterpreted in terms of how noble or ignoble it was? How many times Richard Nixon's reputation has been changed? How many times Bill Clinton's reputation has changed? Well, in the case of the Deerslayer, in a consciousness of undeserving, all of which suggests that Judith didn't deserve Hawkeye's approbation, and as a result walked away feeling as though he had put her down because she didn't deserve it. Scholars discovered that the word was not undeserving, but because they couldn't read Cooper's hand. How many times have your students said, as they say to me, I can't understand what you're writing here? Now, they discovered that the word was not undeserving, but undue erring. UNDUE space erring, ERRING. Now, what is the difference between undue erring? What does undue erring mean, do you think? Well, undue and erring. Erring, we all understand, making mistakes. But what about undue erring? How do we use them? These are both words we don't use very much anymore. But undue might suggest what? Or, unwarranted. So, if we're talking about making mistakes, as in erring, undue erring suggests unwarranted mistakes. That is to say, that interpretation suggests that Judith realized that she indeed had made a mistake, which in fact she had. But as opposed to having Deerslayer, Hawkeye, Pathfinder, Buffalo, put her down, instead, she realized that because she had made a mistake, that is why Hawkeye had said no. The difference, subtle as it may be, is on the one hand, Hawkeye repudiates her unjustifiably. She doesn't deserve it. As opposed to, Hawkeye has his standards. She has made mistakes. She realizes those mistakes. He doesn't accept it. Because she's made the mistakes, she accepts and admits. And therefore, the difference between the two interpretations changes the entire attitude that we have towards both her and Hawkeye and the Deerslayer. That is a simple example of how one single word can change the meaning. Now, think of the possibilities if you give your students documents. For example, Because there is a rich history in the state, and you have to be teaching the history of Oklahoma to be able to address it. But think, for example, of the rich history of the founding, the settlement, and the coming to statehood of Oklahoma. How many historical documents do you think exist in this state at, for example, Gilcrease, or perhaps at the Oklahoma Historical Society, or in any of the rebel rooms at the University of Oklahoma, for example, or any of the other repositories, either in individual towns and in the East, particularly in the 19th century, historical societies grew up like it does. Virtually every town had its own historical society, and every historical society contained papers that dealt with settlement and the history of that particular town. Well, as the nation moved westward,